Well, I'm going to begin by lighting the famous flaming chalice. And here it is. And I'll open, since our topic has to do with global warming this morning, with a poem called Heat by Hilda Doolittle, or as she was more familiarly known, H.D. She was one of the imagist poets of the early 20th century, the group around Ezra Pound that included William Carlos Williams and Amy Lowell and sort of peripherally T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and some other names familiar and unfamiliar. And here's the poem. Oh, wind, rend open the heat, cut apart the heat, rend it to tatters. Fruit cannot drop through this thick air. Fruit cannot fall into heat that presses up and blunts the points of pears and rounds the grapes. Cut the heat, plow through it, turning it on either side of your path. So this morning we're going to talk about adaptation to climate change. Generally speaking, the discussions around global warming and climate change have to do with what do we need to do to stop it, to ameliorate it. But the fact is that it is here, as that picture on the lower left of the title slide suggests. And so we need to be thinking about how we're going to adapt to it, because we're not likely to change it enough soon that we aren't all going to suffer from its effects, and particularly its health effects, since that's obviously what has my attention as a physician most of all. So when we talk about the difference between mitigation of climate change and adaptation, an analogy is suggested by that car crash on the slide. So mitigation of the crash might consist of tapping on the brake so you don't hit the wall quite as fast. That's mitigation. Adaptation is having your seatbelt on so that when the crash occurs, you're not hurt quite as much as you otherwise would be. So adaptation refers to those actions that lessen the impacts of climate change or protect us from those impacts. And it really represents climate resilience. In other words, the ability of communities to predict, to prepare, and to respond to the wages of climate change. So there are three particular ones that I might point out. One is the urban heat island effect, shown by that heat map on the left, in other words, the steady rise in the temperature of our cities, especially, but also unusual heat events. In other words, heat waves. Wildfires and flooding also fit into this category, but we're not going to have time to talk about those, although there are certainly adaptations that we need to be making in those two areas as well. So I'm going to focus really on the urban heat island and what we should be doing in our cities, since we live in one, most of us, and keep in mind what maybe our Reno City Council, our Carson City City Council, and other governmental agencies ought to be doing as we move toward the conclusion of this discussion. Well, this sort of sets the stage for the discussion. On the upper right there, you can see that prior to 1990 and especially prior to 2000, we had alternate years in which temperatures were above the mean for our national temperature between 1900 and about 1990. And that's what that zero line is. So the blue bars are the years in which temperatures were below that mean, and the red bars the years above. And you can see that after 2000, there aren't any blue bars anymore, and the red bars are getting higher. And on the lower left, you can see what the impact is on the mortality of our population, and those are numbers per million people. And you can see that sudden shift after 2000 translates into higher levels of mortality. You'll also notice that in the right part of that graph, there is a distinction made between heat as a direct cause. It's termed here underlying cause, that's the red bar, and heat as a contributing cause of death. And we'll talk about that difference because the latter is a little bit more subtle, and we don't see that impact of heat, but it's very, very important. So this is roughly what we're going to cover. First of all, we'll talk about the urban heat island effect, and both its subtle and its obvious impacts on public health. Then the disparities, racial and ethnic and economic, that increasing heat in our cities and elsewhere poses. And then what interventions can we make to try to decrease this urban heat island effect? And how have they worked where they've been tried? So this is the urban heat island profile, and you can see that the temperatures, particularly in the late afternoon in downtown areas, highest. And they taper off in suburban areas and are lowest in rural areas. And why is that? Well, first of all, there are fewer trees in our downtown areas and some of our suburban areas, and that's where we get to some of the disparities in health that I was talking about. So buildings themselves give off heat. Furthermore, they, if they're not constructed in the ways we'll talk about, they actually reflect a great deal more heat, raising the temperature in the downtown core. The dark roads and asphalt parking lots not only retain heat, but raise the ambient temperature of the downtown and some suburban areas. The surfaces tend to be impermeable, and that reduces surface moisture and transpiration and so on. This is a satellite heat map of the United States. And even though the temperatures are rising faster in the West, which is of course stricken by drought. The actual heat map is more tied to the presence of cities than the overall temperature rise. So that is, of course, a reflection of the urban heat map. So it's not the heat map you might expect if you didn't take into account the role of cities. This is Las Vegas and a satellite heat map of that city. And notice the concentration of red in the northeastern sector of the city, and of course that's where the urban concentration of buildings and parking lots and streets and sidewalks is concentrated. So certainly one of the most important factors in reducing the urban heat island effect is the tree canopy. So shading the ground means less heat from the sun reaches the ground. Trees store less heat and therefore are less of a heat sink than buildings. And their transpiration cools the air around them. So three major factors that trees can contribute to reducing the urban heat island effect. Well, let's talk about heat-related illness. So most of the US will see 20 or 30 more days annually of temperatures above 90 degrees in the coming years of this century. And larger increases are expected in the Southeast, the Southwest, and paradoxically, perhaps, in Alaska, because Alaska and the American Southeast are the fastest heating areas of our country. And by the end of the century, our hottest days will be 10 degrees hotter than they are right now. This is also associated with an increasing number, frequency, and duration of unusual heat events, or what we call heat waves. The average temperature of Las Vegas increased by 6 degrees between 1990 and 2018. Now, the same sort of thing has happened in Reno, just not a full 6 degrees. And in fact, Bill Isaiah is fond of reminding us that when he was a boy, you could ice skate on Virginia Lake, and that's never true anymore. A heat wave now is defined as more than the 90th percentile of the usual temperature for an area at a given time of year. And mortality due to heat-related illness rises by about the third day of a heat wave, and continuing to rise throughout the next several days, peaking around a week or 8 days. And just to remind you of what we mean by heat-related illness, there's heat exhaustion, which as severity increases, transitions into heat stroke with a much higher mortality, of course, than with mere heat exhaustion or heat cramps. So the patient's temperature here with heat exhaustion is below 104, but there's rapid heart rate, there's low blood pressure, there's dizziness, faintness, irritability, and of course some people are irritable anyway, but more irritable than normal for that person, and then loss of coordination, some weakness, nausea, vomiting. Heat stroke is characterized by temperatures above 104, but also rapid heart rate and low blood pressure, confusion, headache, nausea, vomiting, fainting, seizures, hot skin, and classically without sweating. Although some folks with heat stroke can sweat, but certainly that's a major clue when you see someone who's confused, who is hot but not sweating. And of course, as the heat stroke progresses, coma. And the mortality of heat stroke is about 10% at best. That is assuming that therapy is begun promptly, and that's typically immersion in cold water or even ice water. And with delays, the mortality is around 80%. So we don't have to really worry about the heat index in Reno very much. You'll see that the effective temperature is markedly increased by relative humidity, beginning at about 40%. Whereas, of course, here our humidity is typically around 7%. So we're generally not going to see heat index contributing significantly to heat-related illness. What's going to count is the actual temperature, the actual ambient temperature for persons who are exposed to that heat, and particularly those in outdoor occupations or those indoors during a heat wave. Oh, well, that's interesting. All right. But there are certain drugs that can increase the risk of heat-related illness. Alcohol, certainly drugs of abuse, cocaine, methamphetamines. And we really worry about the mentally ill who may be on antipsychotic medication. That's a major one. Some antidepressants, not all, but the tricyclics certainly. Certain antihypertensive medications like beta blockers and certain others. But also things we might think of as fairly innocent, like diuretics, laxatives, decongestants. And this is just a partial list. So these are the dispatches for heat-related illness in Boston, and you can see the direct relationship between the number of calls and the ambient temperature. And the interesting thing is it kind of crosses the line at about 80 degrees. But remember, in Boston, you have to worry about the heat index. So 80 degrees in Boston is more like 90 degrees or more here in Reno. This is the heat-related emergency calls in Toronto. You wouldn't think we'd be talking about Toronto with heat-related illness, but heat-related illness is a problem, right up to Alaska. So notice that there's a direct relationship between the area of the city with a tree canopy that is less than 10%, and the number of heat-related calls during the summer. So here is a relationship between ambient summer temperature and mortality from chronic illnesses. So this is not during a heat wave. This is just during summer temperatures. If for every degree above the accustomed temperature for that time of year in that city, there is a measurable increase in mortality due to these chronic illnesses and certain others. But we've chosen the prominent ones: congestive heart failure, diabetes, chronic lung disease, and heart attacks, myocardial infarction. And you can see that with myocardial infarction, the increase is 7%, a full 7% for every 1 degree centigrade, which is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, increase in temperature above the accustomed temperature for that day of the year in a given city. So that's the difference between what I call the subtle heat-related illnesses and the more obvious ones associated with heat waves and heat stroke and outdoor activities. But there are demographic factors too that begin to translate into some of the health disparities that I was talking about earlier. Being Black in eastern cities, being a Hispanic in Phoenix, being above the age of 65, lacking in air conditioning, and obviously that is related to poverty. Having less than a high school education, which of course is also confounded with poverty. There is a 10% increase in poverty, which is the strongest predictor, and estimated to increase mortality rate by about 4.3% per 10 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature, or at temperatures higher than the typical mean. Homelessness and outdoor occupations. Neighborhoods with poor tree canopy, as we've already cited. So this translates into the racial disparities in the urban heat island effect. And you can see that it's 34% for Blacks in areas with no tree canopy, and 62% in areas of a city with impervious surfaces, and of course with both it goes to 31%. And you can see that similarly there are disparities with respect to being Hispanic or below the poverty line. Here is the mortality, racial disparity, and heat-related mortality by race, and these are rates per 100,000. And you can see that that yellow line representing Black persons leads the pack. So how do we ameliorate the urban heat island effect? Well, first of all, by planting native drought-tolerant shade trees. Obviously, in the desert, we don't want to be planting trees that have a high water demand. The truth is that even with drought-tolerant shade trees, they do need more water to become established, namely for the first 2 or 3 years. Other vegetation. Integrating small green infrastructure into barren areas, vacant lots, street rights of way, and so on. Green roofs are an ideal heat island reduction strategy. That is, those are downtown roofs that are flat and can be planted. This has both direct and ambient cooling effects. It cools the building as well as reducing the increase in ambient temperature around the building. They also improve air quality by reducing or by absorbing pollutants. Then there are cool roof technologies. and we'll talk about that a little bit. And permeable pavements, which allow rainwater to go into groundwater, and also improve storm management. And then finally, light colored or preferably white buildings with what we call a high albedo, not to be confused with libido now. Albedo is a term actually originated by physicists and adopted later by engineers, and it has to do with the reflectivity of light, and it's highest for an absolute white surface, and of course lowest for very dark or black surfaces. So what are construction materials that are cooling? So a cool roof is one that's been designed to reflect more sunlight and absorb less heat than a standard roof. They can be made of highly reflective paints, certain sheet coverings, or highly reflective tiles or shingles. And of course, we talked about green roofs. Cool pavements are both reflective, in other words, light colored, and permeable. Of course, high albedo buildings also have the advantage of requiring less cooling and also radiate less heat to the environment. And cool cars, interestingly, we don't think about that very much, but cool cars offer the same kinds of advantages. They're less expensive to operate, don't require quite as much air conditioning, or consume as much fuel, and they of course radiate less heat into the environment. Think of that picture on the title slide of all of those cars on the Los Angeles freeway radiating heat along with the pavement itself. So here are some different paving materials. So you can see the surface temperature of asphalt is the highest. It's dark. It is not permeable, and the coolest paving material actually are pavers. That is light colored pavers. And you know, our advanced civilization is not the first to think of this. You know, Mediterranean civilizations going back thousands of years have recognized the advantage of white houses. So think of Santorini, think of Tunisia, think of the Pueblos Blancos of Andalusia. And if you like sherry, Jerez de la Frontera is not a bad place to live in the south of Spain as well. This is the permeability of a range of different paving materials. So even pavers can differ in their permeability and what's called hydraulic conductivity. And then finally, cars. So a black car only reflects about 5% of light, but it absorbs the rest as heat, whereas a silver car or a white car reflects about 60% of light and absorbs far less heat. So you might think about that your next car purchase. And if you're thinking in terms of contributing to the urban heat island effect, obviously an electric car is going to contribute far less to the urban heat island effect than a fossil fuel consuming um, car. So this is work from the Livermore Laboratory, and the difference between hot cars and cool cars, and you can see the black cars represent are represented by the red line, and you can see the peak occurs about noon and continues through the afternoon, and that is of the roof temperature, and the green is of course the silver, or I'm sorry, the blue is the silver car, and the green is the difference. So, well, Phoenix has had a climate action plan for quite some time, and they have brought their heat-related deaths down from 172 in 2017 to 134 in 2020. And they did it through a variety of means, paying attention to all of the factors that we've just talked about. They noticed the tremendous difference between the more affluent areas of their city with a lower temperature and the less privileged, more industrial areas of their city represented on the right, without trees, with hot asphalt and sidewalks and vacant lots, and so forth. And they set about working to raise their tree canopy in those areas from less than 10% toward 25%. They are not there yet, but they're well above the average for US cities now. Dallas started somewhat later, and they're actually doing the same sort of thing. And they're actually encouraging trees that overhang the street so that they don't just shade yards and sidewalks, but also shade the street, thereby bringing down the ambient temperature of that area of the city. So this is the or part of the Phoenix Climate Action or Heat Ready plan. They noticed that heat-related mortality and morbidity were in fact highest in Hispanic neighborhoods. The average summer near-ground air temperature in affluent neighborhoods with 25% tree canopy and cool roofs, 99.5 degrees, versus 111 in low-income neighborhoods with regular roofs, no tree canopy, 111 degrees Fahrenheit on the same summer day. An increase in tree canopy cover from 0 to 10% decreases the average neighborhood temperatures by 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, or 2 degrees centigrade. And at 25%, almost 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Tree canopy and cool roofs reduce the demand for air conditioning and therefore anthropogenic heat. That is, when we run our air conditioners, we're increasing the heat of the city. And you may recall in this terrible heat wave that just hit South Asia, that the increase in energy consumption due to increased use of air conditioners and fans and so forth led to rolling blackouts, which in turn increased the heat to which the population was exposed. So it's a terrible, vicious cycle. So pale permeable pavement in parking lots reduces surface temperature by 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Public art pieces can cast shadows without needing any water. Not a bad idea for Phoenix and Las Vegas and to some extent, Reno. I'm reminded of that big whale in our city plaza. Misters, rotating blinds and shade at bus stops, and then cooling centers. So certainly a major part of the Phoenix Heat Ready program was developing cooling centers so persons who did not have access to air conditioning on unusually hot days could repair to those centers and find relief, and therefore, of course, a reduced mortality. And we need to begin to think of that in Reno as well, because our time is coming. So we might think the end is near, but of course the woe is me placard bearer here is saying this will never end, and your optimism disgusts me. And I will leave you with these resources on the urban heat island effect and adaptation. So from the EPA, from the federal funding compendium for even urban heat adaptation, and the Georgetown Climate Center. That is perhaps the shortest talk I have ever given in my life. So I guess that was the benefit of leaving out flooding and adaptation to that risk. So at this point, Dan, why don't you unmute folks, and I'll take a look at the chat too. Leah wants to know if I'm part of the governor's task force on heat-related illness, and no, I am not, but I am chair of the Public Health Commission for the Washoe County Medical Society, and on the Public Health Commission for the Nevada State Medical Association, and we have developed a adaptation statement and proposal for Nevada and local jurisdictions. And it said Nancy Ann wants access to the visual presentation. So thanks to the offices of Dan Pinato, who has helped me make this possible. The video recording will go to the UUFNN YouTube site, and it's generally up by Tuesday. So you will have access to it there. Okay, that's all. Let's see. And Leah says something about solar punk cityscapes. She's going to have to explain what that is. And let's see. Oh, here we go. Some medical and mental conditions can be exacerbated by extreme heat, and some prescription medications work differently in heat. Is this true? And do we know which diseases and medications are more susceptible? Oh, and now they just saw my slide and are intrigued by the fact that decongestants are on the list. Imagine allergy season coinciding with a heat wave. Yeah, that's a good point. All right. What is the site to find the statement developed for state and local governments? Oh, well, yeah, I have to admit, we've not published the Nevada State Medical Association statement yet, but I would refer you to the resources that you see there on the screen. And Jeff Carlton says there was a pledge to provide a carbon offset calculator program through Naomi Doerr's Relief Reno initiative. It would be nice to keep offset dollars local with local benefits. Yes, thanks for referring to the Relief initiative, because that is going to come up for a vote, I think, in the Reno City Council in June, and it directly addresses the tree canopy issue in Reno, because we have the same kind of disparity in the distribution of the tree canopy across our city as other cities that I've cited. So, so that's a really important first step. But you'll also understand, I think, that increasing the tree canopy is only one part of the package of adaptation to global warming in our cities. So, all right. Any unmuted questions or comments?
I have one, Kevin. It's Mary Lee. I was
Yes,
just
Mary Lee.
ready to type it, but you know, it disturbs me driving around Reno. People are trying to save on water by replacing their lawns with little rocks. And those rocks, and sometimes big rocks, right around trees, and they seem to me really make it hotter than if they were to use those chips, the wood chips. Why isn't that part of the urban heat problem?
Well, I think you have identified a really important issue, and you're right. Mulch would be far better, and of course, it is in the desert. It's a definite trade-off between using enough water to increase the tree canopy.
Yes.
And of course, dealing with our drought and saving water. And so that's why it's important to choose species of trees that are native and drought tolerant, that require relatively little water. The other thing, of course, it has to do with how we water, and certainly drip irrigation is far more water consuming than the sprays that we see, oftentimes watering the street more than the yard. Certainly, xeric landscaping can be combined with reducing the urban heat island effect. You know, we don't have to plant grass, although, you know, certainly grass does help reduce ambient temperature, but as you say, we can use drought tolerant trees and mulch and drip irrigation. Does that answer your question, Mary Lee? You're very perspicacious.
It does. That's a good answer. Thank you, Kevin.
Sure.
In fact, I think there should be a law against using rocks
No.
to replace lawns, because they just make everything hotter.
Well,
I'll shut my mouth now.
You can propose it.
you know, if you have to use rocks, be sure they're white.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
that was what I was trying to visualize, what a cool roof would be, because I'm having to replace my roof this year. And the HOA insists upon it being the same concrete tiles. So when you talk about a cool roof, I hope you don't mean sod, because I can't see that happening here. But do you also, is the only other requirement that it be the lightest color possible?
Well, yes. So there are ratings for roofing materials that give you the coolest possible roof, and that's worth taking a look at, and maybe taking a run at your HOA and
Oh yeah.
shifting their priorities toward cool roofs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to plant a green roof, but of course it helps. But you're reminding me that my grandfather built, well, actually it was my great grandfather built a sod house on the plains of the Cherokee Strip in Oklahoma in the end of the 19th century. So,
Sod seems really reasonable in some places.
yeah. So that was a cool roof. All right. Other questions? Well, hearing none, I'll
Walkable communities.
yeah, there you go. That's good for health too. So our next Sunday forum is going to be the Border Justice team talking about border justice, and I think we've got the whole team involved, and that's going to be on the 29th. In other words, our extra Sunday, our fifth Sunday of the month. And let me just see. So Robin Palmer is asking about walkable communities, and I would say tree-lined streets make a community more walkable, especially in the summer.
Yeah.
So that's my answer to that. Yeah, removal of I'm not sure what non-functional grass is, but obviously removing grass ought to be balanced by other measures to improve the permeability and reflectivity and tree canopy of that surface. I think we don't want to willy-nilly just remove grass. I think we need to keep in mind the priority of reducing the urban heat island effect as we do so. Mary Gale is pointing out that deep watering helps trees drive their roots deeper and doesn't require as much water. That's a really good point too. I don't know. I don't know why the Livermore Laboratory studied silver cars and not white cars, Sally, but I think that the same principle applies. And in fact, white cars may even be more reflective, may reflect more than 60% of light as compared to silver cars. But white cars count. Now, my wife hates white cars. I'm probably going to have to settle for a silver car next time, but we'll see. Especially since she hates the current shade of blue that Priuses come in. Let's see. Leah has just put up a good article on the heat island from the Nevada Independent. I'm going to have to look that up myself. That looks good. All right, so Nevada Independent. Extreme temperatures disproportionately affects minority, low-income communities
Yeah.
stuck in heat islands. So obviously that reflects the theme of this talk.
Mhm.
All right. All right. Oh, Leah wants to clarify that non-functional, referring to the grass question, means like medians and right-of-ways that are decorative, decorative only. Okay. So and Robin Palmer's comment is she kind of feels like this discussion is akin to adapting to nuclear war.
Mhm.
I haven't developed a program for that yet. So,
Somebody
and
remembers the 50s.
yeah, well, those adaptations might have been inadequate.
I think
We
so.
probably need something more. I don't know. And Leah says, thank you. Much more hopeful than other climate presentations that she heard last week. Oh, good. Well, I'm glad to provide that. Okay. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves. I think Dan is allowing that.
Mhm.
Another thank you from Nancy Ann. Thank you, Nancy Ann.
Mhm.
All right. Okay. Well, I think we can probably leave the resource screen up for a little longer in case you haven't had a chance to take notes. And we'll, for the first time in the history of the Sunday Forum, let you go early.
Oh, yes.